and welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live video series. And joining me today to share the stories behind the 10 books that influenced him on his life path is globally recognized mind, body, health and wellness expert, mindful performance trainer, and meditation teacher and trainer, davidji, who's taught millions of people around the world to heal their hearts, plant powerful intentions, and manifest their dream lives. davidji is credited with creating the 21-day meditation process, which spawned hundreds of 21-day meditation experiences and challenges around the world. And he's also the author of several much lauded books, including Sacred Powers, The 5 Secrets to Awakening Transformation, and the Amazon bestseller, De-Stressing, The Real World Guide to Personal Empowerment, Lasting Fulfillment, and Peace of Mind, to name just 2 of his titles. Of course, there's much, much more to davidji than that, as we hope to learn as he shares some of the stories behind his 10 best spiritual book choices. Welcome. It's good to have you with us. And before we start discussing your 10 best spiritual books, 2 questions that we always ask. And the first is, what do books mean to you?
Well, you know how there's that phrase, certain music is the soundtrack of your life. And I think that for me, books have been that soundtrack. And as I've gone through different stages, some books are like so important to me. And, you know, I've collected books and collected books. We all have some time looking at Cornelia's bookshelf behind her. You know, we all have that. And there are some of those books that honestly, like we read when we were like 8 or 12 or 18 or 28, whatever that is, or 38, and we've never touched them since because they've woven themselves into who we are. And every once in a while, we may peel them off and go like, oh yeah, that. So I believe books are portals to awakening, and I think that they define sort of like the launch or the flow of certain periods of our life.
Yeah, they're like stepping stones, aren't they?
Yeah, beautiful.
So how much of a challenge was it for you to have to just come up with 10 books?
Oh my God, it was so high stressed, high pressured, because, you know, come up with the 10. That's like, what are your 10 favorite songs? You know, it goes forever. And as I said to you, Sandie, you know, I could have come up with another 10 and another 10. But I guess when you first invited me to come up with my list, first I meditated probably for a half hour, just letting go of everything. And then I allowed those books. Some of them are books that I'm reading right now. Some of those are books that I've always continued to read. And some of them just were like so important. And my original list, when I just figured I'd make up the list, it was about 25 books long. And then, which is how I write, you know, I write it all, and then I refine it and come down. So I felt as I was going through that process, I was like, well, maybe the next time she asks, I'll put this on the list, but it's not going to make it to the top 10 right now.
Yeah, I've heard this a few times. So I think this is one of those things I'll have to go back a few years later and say, okay, now let's have another list and look at that. And I was so interested. The first book on your list is the Bhagavad Gita as it is. I'm not going to say the name of the person that translated it because it's unpronounceable for me. I don't know if you want to, but this book, I mean, it's astonishing because you made a commitment to read this book every single day, and you have. And I want to know what would happen if you didn't read it one day.
Well, it's become a beautiful habit of mine. There are certain habits that we say, oh, you know, don't do that habit, you know. And I think once I had heard that Einstein read it every day, I figured, oh, well, I'll be in good company if I can do that. I didn't intentionally start to read it every day. A mentor of mine, Dr. David Simon, and one of his books is on the list as well. But he said, you need to read the Gita. And I was like, I read the Gita in college. And he's like, it was a while ago. So go back and read it. And so I sat down and read it. And the translation that I used at the time was Eknath Easwaran's, which is it's a fairly tight, it's not that fat. But over the years, there's been so many types of Gitas. I just happen to have my rolling bookshelf out here in my treehouse. Then I got into this one, which is like the Gita divided into 2 volumes by Paramahansa Yogananda. It's a fatty. This is one of my faves as well. But as I continue to read and read and read all these varying translations of the Gita, I realized, depending on the translator, depending on the mindset of the translator, so it's not just someone being able to translate Sanskrit into English, but like what's their worldview. And so that has really made it more profound. This is that book, the Bhagavad Gita, as it is, and it's a fatty. It's because it doesn't just contain the Gita, which is 700 verses and 18 chapters, but it's the sort of like musings and mini translations of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, which is that name. And so, but it's hard to carry one of these around. So I got this, which is like the smaller version of
Pocket version.
the pocket version, although it's not so pockety. It's still pretty, it's still pretty beefy. And I was most touched because you can read, here's a copy of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's translation. Every translation puts just a little bit of a different spin on the same exact sentence. And when I read this one, particularly in chapter 2, verse 47, which of course I've read thousands of times, and I've read it in all different contexts, but there's this one line. Pretty much everyone distills chapter 2, verse 47 down to you've total control over your own actions, but no control over the fruit of those actions. So we pretty much sort of get that. And that's really a very, very important lesson, which really is the guidance is be here now. But then in this particular translation, he follows that with never consider yourself the cause of the results of your activities. And just that one, that's actually only half the sentence. Something else follows, but never consider yourself the cause of the results of your activities. When you read something like that, it really makes you then suddenly think about all your activities and all the things you've taken credit for and all the things you've blamed yourself for. And really all we have is that moment when we're doing that thing, whatever that thing is. And so that particular translation, just because of that one little line, and there's 700 verses there, but that one line said, I think this guy really is speaking to me. And I believe that when we read a book, also when we hear someone speaking, but there's this convergence. And I believe transformation can happen in a book if it's the right messenger. Pretty much that messenger is someone that's resonating with you at a particular time. You like their writing style or the way they express themselves. The message, what they're saying, has to click in some way, and timing. And if one of those 3 things is not available in that moment, the transformation doesn't occur and the spark doesn't occur. So we've all read a whole bunch of books where we're like, oh, that was interesting. And perhaps if we had read it at a different moment in our life, it would have been the most transformational thing we ever read. It was like, yeah, I like that author, I like their style, and that was pretty cool, but it didn't necessarily speak to your heart, to your soul in that moment. And so I believe message, messenger, and timing is so critical in everything we read, in everything, pretty much in every moment. But when I was coming up with my list, it was, those were the books where the message, the messenger, and whatever it is, I was highly receptive in that moment. And I think that speaks to all of us. If we're really, really receptive, we're thirsty for what that is, it strikes a chord, and we're never the same.
I agree. I mean, there have been times I've picked up a book and went, ugh, and then a few years later I pick up this book and I don't even know that I picked it up before and go, this is fantastic. So you said that, this epic ancient story impacted you at the soul level and continues to teach you every single day. What was going on in your life at the time that you first read that one?
Well, I have to give credit to whatever the reading list was when I was in uni, whenever I was in college, because whoever came up with that list, some of those books stuck with me, and some of them I was like, these are the books I will hold on to. These are my seeds for the rest of my life. And I was heavily into philosophy at the time, reading Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Kant and all these other. And then I started picking up some of these really more ancient texts. And when I picked up the Bhagavad Gita for the very first time, I didn't really know how old it was, but I could tell it was sort of a deeper messaging for me. And so, I was a 19-year-old college student, and who knows what our priorities are or what our visions are, belief systems, in that moment. And the Bhagavad Gita really is a story between Arjuna, presumably the greatest warrior who ever lived, and God, Krishna, God disguised as Krishna, certainly in that moment. And so for me, it was reading the tale, very, very similar to Merlin and Arthur. That's how I viewed that. And of course, these are themes that have existed for thousands of years. And the Bhagavad Gita was written supposedly around 300 BC, so 2,300 years ago, certainly before Merlin and Arthur ever had their combo. And I think what for me, what it struck was, oh, there's a wise sage speaking to a conflicted young man. And probably at the moment, I could really have benefited from that. So I used that as one of the tools to really help give me guidance. In the Bhagavad Gita, there are so many answers to questions that we have, but it sort of forces you to even ask more deeper questions. Just as you see this going on, you translate it, well, what about my life? And what about my choices? And what about the things that I dream and desire? So for me, I was highly impressionable as a young 19-year-old, read that book, and I was like, oh. And that was one of those books that I read probably kept on my bookshelf for about, who knows, 2 or 3 years, and then it faded into the back, and it was not reawakened again until 2003. So I won't tell you what year I was in college, but suffice to say, it was 20 years plus. And so suddenly I was in the same exact space in my life where I could really have used some insightful, wise person to sort of guide me on my next step, or guide me from where I was, or bring clarity to my life at the time. And so then I read, oh, of course, Emerson read it every day. Oh, yes, of course, Thoreau read it every day. Oh, and Einstein read it, and Gandhi read it. So it's like, shouldn't everybody be reading this?
Wow, that's so interesting. So when you picked it up again, was it just like meeting, somebody that you knew and loved a long time ago, but had forgotten how much you loved them, and suddenly you rediscover that, and it's just an amazing experience all over again?
Yes, that's a beautiful way of putting it. And quite honestly, I was distinctly different, and so was the messenger, it seemed. And one of the beautiful things about the Gita is that we don't know who wrote that. So here's this timeless story, and it's not necessarily about the author, but really the content of the words, and that's why we develop affiliations to the various translators, because they're the ones, we think, oh, I'm reading this translation, that's the person who wrote it. And really, I guess in a certain context, they did write it. But the Gita has that beautiful ability for you to just like thumb through it and then just read a verse. And similar to the Bible, I guess, in a sort of way. So it almost doesn't matter where you are in that moment. You just flip it open and then go like, oh, and then you read the line, and then you can just sit and reflect on the line and think about the line and what does that mean to me, and then you start to develop that internal conversation. And I believe that as we continue to nourish that internal conversation, it ultimately becomes our external conversation as well.
And do you find yourself being guided to different versions, on different days?
Well, I do, and I still have them scattered around my house. I have a Gita in my living room, a Gita in my tool shed, a Gita in my car, which I have not been using as much as I used to. Now I just use my car to go to the supermarket and back, since everything's shut down here. But I have one in my bathroom. I have one in the kitchen. I have one on my dining room table. I have one on my nightstand. So I'll reach for them, and it's funny. Over the years, I can just pull the Gita, read a line, and go, "Oh, that's that translator," because I can tell like who they are and what they're trying to convey. So I think that is certainly one of the most profound continuous messages that continues to nourish me. And I've never picked it up and cracked it open and said, huh, what does that have to do with me? No matter what I pick up, it's like the magic 8-ball, shake it up a little bit and then you look and whatever. So it connects to me at a very deep level. And I encourage people, if you're going to start to read the Gita, get a bunch of them. It can be the same exact Gita, but scatter it around. So just before you sit down to watch Netflix, crack open the Gita. Just before you start chopping your onions for dinner, crack open the Gita. Just before you go to bed at night, crack open the Gita. And I don't think you can go wrong, no matter where you are in there.
Yeah. And was that your first choice? Was that the first one that occurred to you when you started creating the list?
Oh yes, because I like I said, this is pretty much where I spend my time, in my treehouse every day, staring at the little green dot. And so I'm surrounded by probably about 13 different Gitas here right now. There's this beautiful one, and then there's this beautiful one. I can go on and on. And some of them are very, very, so I am a Gita collector. And so some of them are beautifully, there's beautiful pictures in them. I even have the comic book of the Bhagavad Gita. But yeah, that is the first one, because that I've used the Bhagavad Gita, or it's used me, really as a guiding light. And I think it informs pretty much everything else that I do.
Yeah.
Because if you think about, this conversation, and many people have written versions of this over the years, Neil Donald Walsh, Conversations with God, and so many people, their conversations with the divine. And so the Bhagavad Gita is that first, at least one that I touched, and going back 2,300 years, that's pretty safe to assume for many of us. It's a full-on conversation with God at a moment of conflict, at a moment of crisis, at a moment where you're at a crossroads. And I think we all sometimes on a micro day, on a daily basis, find ourselves at crossroads. And I think on a weekly basis, we do as well, perhaps on a monthly basis. And certainly there are years where it's like, I'm at a crossroads here. I can either move that way, maybe even that way, and I could go back. And then suddenly we start to realize, well, there's a little guidance here. Let me, if I'm going to take a step in some direction, whether it's a fork in the road or a crossroads, let me have as much information as I can to help me make the best choice. And I think that's what the Gita always provides us with. And I think, you could just pluck a line and it's pretty much God saying, well, here's a good way to live your life, and here's another thing for you to think about. And the number one lesson of the Gita in every single translation that you could ever find is pretty much the line, don't be overcome by inaction. Whatever your duty is, whatever your responsibility, whatever your charge is in a particular moment, act. And sometimes even saying, I'm just going to take a pass here and allow this thing to flow through can also be an action. But essentially what they're saying is, don't distract yourself or don't run away from the challenge. Meet the challenge head on. And you may decide to fight through. You may decide to move away. You may decide to just be present, but you have to at least address. So for someone who's a procrastinator, that would be the perfect book to help you keep going and keep moving and keep flowing, no matter what. Because we all sometimes face a challenge and it's so big, we just like, I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm just going to not really take my responsibility in this moment. And I think it encourages us to take some time, and probably chapter 2 verse 48, where Krishna, God, says, Yogastha kuru karmani, establish yourself in the present moment and then take action. So a lot of people who are on the spiritual path, they get a bad rap because people say, oh, well, you just want to sit in a cave and withdraw from the world and not have anything to do with it. And well, no, the lesson is, get still and then show up and be your best, which I think is a really important reminder to all of us.
Indeed. Yeah. So book number 2 is Walden by Henry David Thoreau, also known as Life in the Woods, and that was published in 1854.
Well, yeah. And he was 27 at the time that he moved to his little cabin in the woods. And I think he spent about 2 years really writing about those experiences. And quite honestly, he did what anyone who has very little responsibility might do, commune with nature. Let me just sit, I wish we all had that ability to just, observe, drink it in, and write, and really discuss that interplay between, the swirl of life around us and our personal connection to our individual journey in that moment. And so one of the beauties of Walden, or at least how he laid it out, is he laid it out seasonally. And he spoke, what are the nuances of each of the seasons. And so we've seen this with painters. Great painters have painted the same exact scene, going through each of the 4 seasons. And of course, we can use that metaphorically in our own lives as we go through the various seasons of the year, or the various seasons of our life. And I think he was very bold in his descriptions and understandings of what was going on, because even so withdrawn from the world, and so withdrawn from what we would normally consider our world, he was probably totally embedded with the world. But even as we, go off someplace to ponder our navels and see what's happening, the lessons, whether you're living in a high rise in the busiest of places, or whether you're off on some, farm or desert or jungle, or wherever you happen to be, cruising around, the challenges are the same, because it doesn't really matter what's happening outside of you as much as all that interplay that we take internally. And I think that's something that we all need to recognize whenever we're starting to think, oh, I'm different from everyone else. We're all the same. We're all thinking about stuff that happened. We're all trying to figure out what our best move would be.
Hmm.
We're all holding on to a regret or a grievance. We all haven't forgiven ourselves for something or forgiven somebody else. We all could use a little more love. You know, there's some of these things are just like, they're just universal. And uh, one of those takeaway lines or mic drop lines from Walden is when Thoreau says or writes, you know, we loiter in winter while it is still spring. And
Yeah.
so I have that just as like a little whisper in my ear whenever I find myself suddenly thinking about something that's already carved in stone. It's done. And so can I use it as a tool as opposed to thinking, oh, this thing that happened to me? How about flip it on its head and make it into this thing that happened for me? And I think we can certainly translate that into what's been going on, certainly on our planet for the last year.
Yeah,
You know,
indeed. And you could say that about several of your books. You know, as I was reading through your descriptions, I was thinking, wow, they're all so relevant.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's really that helped inform my list, because you know there's a lot of books that I've read and I was like, well, that was good, and then I've moved on. Maybe messenger timing wasn't necessarily there, but these books, you know, all of the books on my list have continued to be a balm for my heart and nourishment for my mind, and you know, deep healing for my soul as well.
Yeah. Well, to me, that's, you know, that's the mark of a really great book, is that it's never not relevant. And the wisdom is always useful because it's universal, it's truth. And it
Yeah,
never dies and it never dates.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So number 3 is the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And you say just pick a translation and begin there. And this too was compiled, what, in the 2nd or 3rd century CE? So,
Yes, well, Patanjali is an interesting character because the descriptions of him, they say he either lived 200 years before Christ or 200 years after Christ, somewhere in that 400 years. And so we're like, so, you know, we know exactly where in our world, we know exactly where everyone has lived. But that's like saying, did Barack Obama know William Shakespeare? You know, they're like 400 years apart. And so, you know, part of that is amusing to me. There's always been a little, you know, confusion over, you know, when this truly was written. But it is for the very first time that someone actually compiled all the components of yoga. And this is also, you know, yoga is spoken about, and yoga just means union with the divine or oneness of existence. And of course, in our modern parlance, yoga is the physical, you know, practice, that those physical asanas that we're doing all the time. But of course, you know, going back 2,000 years, Patanjali is really speaking of like, no, it's codes of behavior, it's sensory deprivation, it's pranayam, breathing practices, it's cultivating your attention, it's meditation, and then it's living a life that's fully integrated. Those are the 8 limbs, you know, that he speaks of. And yet if you go into a yoga studio, well, we won't be doing that now, but even if you go to a yoga class online, typically they're not talking about these things. So I've always been struck so much more by the deeper philosophy of yoga than the physical practice. And I'm a certified yoga teacher. So I have, you know, taught classes. I haven't taught in the last several months here, certainly, but well, some people are, and I applaud you, and keep doing that. If you're teaching online, keep raising the vibration there. But there's so much more to the concept of union, of oneness, of really seeing ourselves as fully integrated beings, that we're not really separate from each other, and we're not separate from anything. Everything is so interwoven, and that's really the number one lesson that Patanjali teaches us. And he says, yeah, you could live a life where you're fully merged with the universe. And then he brilliantly says, oh, by the way, there's also the life that we're living, where we feel separate, and where we have all these modifications, and we have memories, and suddenly we're drifting into the past, and we're floating into the future, and we're not being present. So I appreciate the fact that even someone 2,000 years ago is being so so honest, as opposed to this woo-woo spiritual concept where, where the answer is, some mermaid, dolphin, rainbow type of experience. He really comes so clearly into well, really what the Yoga Sutras is how would an enlightened being live their life? And so it's not, he doesn't talk about God inside there. He doesn't talk about, he's not talking about conversations with God. He's really talking about, if you want to get to that space of oneness, these are the ways to proceed. And before that, everything was tribal, and everything was just a recommendation here or there, or part of some type of school. But he pulls it all together, and here we are 2,000 years later, talking about it, living it. There's yoga studios all over the place. There's yoga, yoga attire, as well. And I think it's certainly become a big part of our world.
Massive part of our world. Yeah. And you said that, this is the text that you've come back to over and over again to help you understand methods to live your life with greater grace and ease.
If we think about what's the starting point, the very, very first teaching is Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. That's the second sutra, which is oneness is the progressive quieting of the fluctuations of the mind. So that sort of sets the table for the entire experience, because that's what we have to do. And it pretty much, if we go back to chapter 2, verse 48 of the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna says, Yogastakuru Karmani, establish yourself in the present moment and then perform action, they're dovetailed. They're pretty much on the same page. And I think that then he proceeds to say, well, here's the foundation. It's not about the physical action. It's not even about meditation. That's coming. But first, we have to, what's the code? And he lays out that code in the yamas, which is the first branch or limb of yoga. What are the codes that we're going to live our life by? And that first code is ahimsa, which is nonviolence, which is also the Hippocratic Oath, which is the first step that any doctor or physician, the pledge that they make in their practice, first, do no harm. So there's so many things that flow from this most ancient teaching. And so Hippocrates probably reading the Yoga Sutras at some point.
Yeah. And it's a book that is, many people should be reading now every day. I mean, it's something that the kids should be reading in school.
Absolutely. And again, there are so many translations and versions. I've seen the Yoga Sutras for kids. I've seen the Yoga Sutras for couples. I've seen the Yoga Sutras for people who feel disenfranchised, and so many different types of translations over the years. So yes, I heartily recommend it.
Number 4 is Ulysses by James Joyce, published in 1922, and another timeless classic, as you say. Another one that you said that we can read over and over and continue to glimpse deeper insights from.
Yeah, well, Joyce, clearly, one of the greatest writers of all existence, and not just our time, and Ulysses really takes the ancient myth, the hero's journey.
Yeah.
And going back to the Odyssey, and pretty much takes the Odyssey, the ancient Greek epic, and just transports it into Dublin in a day. And that's, again, I guess as I'm saying this, I'm suddenly realizing, I guess I like when people compartmentalize something into seasons or a day or something along those lines. Joyce goes deep into really into the microcosm of what was going on, certainly in Dublin in the early 1900s. What was that mindset? What was the relationship? But you can see on so many different levels where there's a hero's journey. We have a hero's journey in our personal core relationships. There's a journey that we're taking, which really moves us through our careers, our dharma or our purpose that we find ourselves in life. There's that same type of journey, reflecting and trying to help us figure out, like, what's my place in the world? What's really that what am I here for, and how shall I move? And you can take that on a micro or macrocosm concept as well. And so the hero's journey really is this journey where we feel orphaned or separate from source or something, and there's a calling. All of us have heard it at some time. We feel separate, and then there's an invitation. Some have said it's an invitation to adventure, and some have said, oh, it's an invitation for a very purposeful journey. And so you head off on the journey, and we have our highs and lows and our trials and tribulations and our peaks and valleys over that. A lot of these are tests that we have. And then at some point in our life, if we're fortunate, we will get smacked down by something, whether that's a financial loss or a health loss or a relationship loss or a loss of clarity, in our lives. And or we'll truly feel that separation, and we're on this journey, and we're moving through the journey. And as we discover certain challenges and transcend them, or trials, and try to fight through them, there is that moment where there's some people refer to it as the dark night of the soul, but it's really where we come into the abyss, where we truly are, struggling so deeply, and we're just about to give up, just about to say, you know what, never mind, whatever, and this is why people kill themselves, because in that moment they don't have that hope. All hope is extinguished. And so the hero's journey says, don't give up hope, because when you are in the depth of that abyss, in the depth of your darkness, there's sort of like an aha moment, or there's a spark. And we all have to hit that bottom, whatever, it's different for everybody, and question everything, and lose faith, and do all those things that we do. But then there's that moment where we suddenly go, oh, maybe there is hope. Maybe I lost faith, but maybe I get it back. And really, this is what Leopold Bloom is going through just over a 24-hour period, mimicking the journey of Odysseus, and in the Odyssey. And the hero's journey ends where you, and all mythologically, the hero's journey, there's an elixir or a special chant or some icon or piece of jewelry, like the Holy Grail, things along those lines. And you say to yourself, there is an answer, and I have found the answer. I got the answer. This is so great. And then, of course, the hilarity is the hero returns to the village with the answer, with the elixir, with the special tool, or whatever that, the mystical orb, whatever it is, and thinking that I'll liberate everybody now. Everyone will benefit from this. But of course, not everyone's been on your journey. So the villagers are not always so receptive. to the hero's return, and then the hero begins to feel isolated or orphaned or separate again, and then begins on another journey. And so Joyce managed to talk about, you know, the Irish people and the Irish mindset of feeling so disenfranchised from, you know, their lives, from their history, from whoever was dominating them at the time, as well as individuals as we move through life. And he did it on a very personal level and on a highly universal level as well. And I love that journey from the personal to the universal and back again, that consistent flow that seems to really move through all aspects of our life.
And that book came into your life when you were quite young, because you wrote your senior thesis on it, didn't you?
Yes, yeah. And that was it was a very, very powerful, again, another defining moment or crossroads in my life. And really what spoke to me was my thesis was really about, you know, the Irish analogy of the the Israelites being in bondage coming out of ancient Egypt, you know, being slaves and coming out of ancient Egypt, and the parallels that I found, certainly Joyce going deep into, of the Irish mindset of feeling that they were always like the, you know, the stepchild of England, or the, you know, not really being respected or elevated, and them having to make their own journey out of there. Still struggling with that one, but it's woven into the consciousness of Ireland. And so it's so interesting when people have been oppressed, even if it goes back thousands of years or hundreds of years. There's something in their ancestral follow through that goes through that makes them, you know, it's a victim mentality to a certain extent. And so it's not just in the culture, it's in the individual as well, which is why it's so important to keep moving, and to keep moving from victim to survivor to thriver in all aspects of our life.
Looking at the order of that book and reading your description and comparing it to the next book on your list, you know, there's a correlation there. I mean, the Ulysses story, it's a story that has continued throughout time. You know, it's a never-ending story. It might end over there and it begins over there. The fifth book, which is The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. Now,
I do just want to say something. Someone in the chat is saying, will we be able to access the top 10 list somewhere? It's on the No BS
Spiritual
website.
Book Club website.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It is.
So what is that website so everyone can go there?
At the moment, it's on my website, which is sedgbeer.com, and just click on the tab that says No BS, you know.
There we go.
Spiritual Book Club.
Thank you, Cornelia.
And you will find David
popped that in there for us.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. You'll find his list there. And I mean, they're brilliant descriptions. I mean, you gave the longest descriptions anyone's ever given, and they were so thorough. No, it was a good thing. It was a good thing. Because most people just want to dash it off in 2 lines. But I mean, it was really, really fascinating reading it, because some of these books, several of these books I haven't read. So it gave me such a good feel for them that I want to read them. So
well, hopefully I've inspired you to read some of the books on this list.
Add to my list, yes, indeed. So number 5, this was published in 1903, and you say that W.E.B. was one of the greatest scholars in our history and the first Black person to receive a doctorate from Harvard. And I had never heard of him at all. So I'm, you know, especially grateful for you bringing this one to my attention. So tell us when this came into your life and how it impacted you.
Yeah, this was brought into my life at a very early age. Probably I was too young to even grasp it, but it's one of those books that I have consistently return to over and over. His name looks like it's Dubois, but it's W-E-B, Du Bois, is how
Oh, that's okay.
is how he pronounced it.
Okay.
But everyone mispronounces it because you would see Dubois and you would think Dubois.
French, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, or Cajun or something like that. So yes, this came into my life at an important time for me. I was raised in a Black family growing up, and so this is really powerful to me because I had no idea what the concept of consciousness even was. And now I would say, if someone says, "What's consciousness?" I would say, "Oh, awareness," and I would just put in that. But of course, we could talk for months about what is consciousness, and he was really the first person to put out there that that there are people, certainly that Black people are living with this concept of a double consciousness. They're seeing themselves as a Black person in a white world, and they're seeing themselves as members of whatever society that they're living in. And of course, in more modern times, we could extrapolate that into if you're part of the LGBT community, you see yourself as separate and distinct. You're living with that consciousness in a heterosexual world. You can see yourself as a woman. Certainly, if you're working in a male-dominated society, and suddenly we can start to really see ourselves that the concept of dual consciousness really impacts all of us, especially if we have a certain identity that we have embraced at some point in our life. And that's certainly now there's lots of conversation about gender and about identity and about who gets to call themselves whatever they want to call themselves. Interestingly enough, when they do the census here in the United States and they come to your door, of all the thing, they can tell that you're a male or a woman, pretty much by your presenting yourself. But again, you get to identify how you want. So there are people who might obviously look like a man, but they are identifying as female, and vice versa, whatever that looks like. And the phrase Latino in the United States, our southern border is Mexico. And below that, South America. Pretty much everyone's speaking Spanish, except for Brazil, they're speaking Portuguese. But an entire world is below our southern border, and yet being Latino is one of those things. Anyone here right now, if you suddenly felt, no, I'm in my heart, I'm Latino, you could check the box that says I'm Latino. So we really are entering the age where people's self-description of their identity is the one that matters, as opposed to the one that's being viewed. Now, of course, if you are a person of color, you're obviously a person of color. But there are very, very, very light-skinned people who are also, they're Black and they identify as Black, and no one would necessarily, even know that. Just the concept that Du Bois would start sharing this conversation in the 1900s, when in the United States Blacks couldn't vote, women couldn't vote either. But even when women got the right to vote, it was really white women who pushed that forward, and it was more about white female enfranchisement, as opposed to women's suffrage. And so Du Bois is certainly bold, a brilliant scholar, written so many other books as well. But I think, he sort of like laid the groundwork for us just to understand people at a deeper level. And I think this is an important aspect of emotional intelligence that that Daniel Goleman has talked about. That could have been on my list, something that Daniel Goleman wrote, who's popularized the concept of emotional intelligence. But we need to understand that that someone's going through a different reality than we are in every single moment, and we can't paint everyone with our reality. And we can have that arrogance, we can have that imposition, but if we don't really take a step back, then we're not really getting them at a deeper level. And so, Du Bois spoke about, that you moving through life, feeling your two-ness. Here I am talking about yoga and union and oneness. And here's someone in the early 1900s writing about the two-ness of reality. How impossible would it be for someone like Du Bois to read the Bhagavad Gita, experience that oneness? He would have to transcend his dual consciousness to come into that. And similarly, I find that same thread running through Ulysses. That's really what Joyce was talking about.
Yeah.
You could say, I'm a I'm a person on the global stage, but I'm also this other thing that it's my lens that I look through life with. And we need to, if we really want to know someone, we sort of have to be willing to acknowledge that they have a totally different lens, a lens we've never looked through, a lens we'll never look through, a lens we have just no capacity to even look through. And that can really be our own expansion of consciousness, realizing that other people are looking at, 7.6 billion people on the planet and 7.6 billion lenses. Even if we say, oh no, I have the same belief system as you, I voted for the same person as you, all this. There's a beautiful red-tailed hawk flying overhead right now, which is one of the reasons I love working outside here. And if you know what the meaning of seeing a red-tailed hawk flying over your head, it could just be, oh, there's a red-tailed hawk flying over your head. But I think it probably has some spiritual meaning for this moment. And so I think that Du Bois should be read by everyone, because he's coming from the most, really from the depth of his soul. He's not trying to school us. He's not trying to educate us. He's not trying to impose his will on us. He's not trying to be right. He's not trying to teach us. He's not woke and trying to convince us. He really speaks from his soul to whoever the reader is in that moment. And I think it will awaken not just your deeper understanding of to have, that there needs to be so much more respect for everyone that we can't be colorblind. Color is real. It's real, and it's impacting how people live their lives and the opportunities that they get and how they're treated, and so many other aspects. And I think he was that. Without Du Bois, there's no Martin Luther King. Without Du Bois, there's no Mandela. Without Du Bois, there's no John Lewis. We can go on and on with what that looks like. But for someone so brilliant and so, so scholarly, so sharp, really has had a lasting impact on me my whole life. And I have read that book probably every 10 years. That cycles in. Oh, by the way, I just want to let you know, Sandie, once I made this list, I was like, you know what? Some of these books I haven't really checked out recently. So I reread everything. Reading Ulysses just made my head hurt because I hadn't read it in about 8 years. But I went through the entire list and I figured if I'm going to tell people these books are important to me, I'm going to read them all right now. Some of them I'm reading daily, but others, so I brought them all back into my universe.
So was that the reward for the task?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. A lot of other things did not get done, but that got done, and it was a powerful reward. And so thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, wow. My pleasure. One of the things that touched me about what you wrote about this was, and you said that you've etched Du Bois's words from the souls of Black people pretty deeply into your heart. And you quote a couple of things, but one of the things that I thought was a beautiful reminder was when you said that Du Bois asks us all to consider, do you flow your most authentic expression in your thoughts, words, and actions, in your relationships, in your career, in conversations with friends, in social media postings, or do you pander and compromise and virtue signal so others like you, accept you, or don't get their feathers ruffled? And, you know, this is something that I think all of us struggle with. And we're seeing this now because so many people feel they cannot say what they're really thinking and feeling because there's so much tension out there, you know, that they're just going to be jumped on, and they really can't afford to offend anyone.
Yeah, well, we can afford to offend everyone. We just don't think we can.
Yes,
You know,
exactly.
that's the thing. And then we have to, you know, I mean, we're in an age of cancel culture, or in an age where, you know, no one gets off the hook, or people can just be like obliterated overnight. We're also in an age where people feel they need to comment and opine on the snack that they had, you know, last evening. So when we look at stuff like that, sometimes it can be maddening.
Yeah. But again, as you said, that his message is that if we're going to serve the world, we must be strong, we must be clear, we must be open-hearted, we must be courageous, etc., etc. And this is such a timely reminder. So I'm thanking you for giving me that reminder.
You're welcome.
So number 6, and this book is probably up there with the top 10 of the top 10s. You know, certain books come up again and again and again, and it's very easy to see why. The 4 Agreements, A Practical Guide to Personal Freedom by Don Miguel Ruiz. Love this book. Absolutely love this book. So tell us when you read it and what was happening in your life at that time that this book may have helped you with.
Yeah, well, the mid to late 90s was a powerful literary time for straight talk spirituality.
Yes.
This book came first. This book, I believe, was written in 1995 by Don Miguel Ruiz. In 1996, Deepak Chopra wrote 7 Spiritual Laws of Success. And in 1998, I think, Eckhart Tolle wrote The Power of Now.
Yeah.
So suddenly you have this burst of not to say there wasn't a lot of other spiritual commentary going on, but this sort of launched the acceptance from, say, 95 to 99, this like next wave of people taking spiritual insights and weaving them into our lives. And, you know, one of the beauties of Don Miguel's books, it doesn't come off as a spiritual book. Comes off as like, hey, here's 4 great rules to live your life by. Of course, these 4 great rules were taken directly from Buddha's teachings, the Noble Eightfold Path, but distilled down. And the book is also, you know, it's a pretty thin, you know, it's an easy read. And the fact that also it's like, just by taking only 4 steps, be impeccable with your word. We could all benefit from that. Don't take anything personally. We're all taking everything personally on a constant basis. Don't make assumptions. So often there's miscommunication because we just assume what somebody else said or did, or we assume another person's intentions. And lastly, always do your best. And so we could say even always do your best goes back to chapter 2, verse 48 of the Bhagavad Gita.
Yes.
You know, a mere 2,300 years before then, you know, to establish yourself in the present moment and then perform your action. You know, get still and then be brilliant. And so just these 4 simple, they could be fortune cookies, you know, the messages inside a fortune cookie. They're so concise. And I think that is really Don Miguel's greatest achievement. A lot of people say, oh, and there's other stuff he's written, and like, yes, prolific and beautiful and amazing. And he's a friend of mine, so of course I'm saying I'm not saying kind things about him just because, I know him. But if you can come up with like 4 statements that can live so concretely, if I asked everybody right now, okay, tell me the 10 commandments. They've existed for 6,000 years or so, and everyone's heard them and everyone's had them, and people have, whatever, we could probably come up with 3. But, you say if people know about the 4 agreements, it's like so clear, so concise. What beautiful messages in every single moment that we could just, even have as just like little mantras floating through our heads. So whether these are coming from the Buddha, because even if I said to you, okay, what's the Noble Eightfold Path? You might go, right speech, right action, and then forget the other 6. But here, boom, he really lays out in such a such a clear and concise way 4 ways to live your life that you can probably fold into every conversation, every interaction, and every even conversation that you're having with yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is the kind of book that just brings me to silence, because there's nothing to say about it, because it is, and it's true, and that's it. You just can't argue with it. I'm very conscious of your time, so we're going to go a bit quicker now. Book number 7. This is a surprise, and you tell everybody it's going to be a surprise. Dominion, The Power of Man, the Suffering of Animals, and the Call to Mercy by Matthew Scully. And you say definitely not the book you expect from the former speechwriter of President George W. Bush.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to be reading knowing that, and I think it might even say that on the back cover, when talking about, just his quick little bio. It's impossible to read the book without always having that in your awareness, that again, we are so much more than just our last job, if that would define us. This is a book that I talk about David Simon, being such an important mentor to me. And actually, December 7th was his birthday. He's since passed on 8 years ago, but he was a vegetarian since he was 17. And I had gone through stages of being vegan and vegetarian and only eating meat and only eating animals and only eating seafood and, doing whatever. And he and I spent every day with each other for about a 10-year period. And our offices were 15 feet apart. And he was my closest friend during that period of time. And, we would go out and I would be eating, chicken sandwich, and he'd be eating, some beans or something like that. And, we'd finish our meal and we'd just have a conversation, and he'd say to me, so how did you feel about eating that chicken sandwich? And I said, yeah, it was pretty good, but I feel a little conflicted. I feel conflicted that like an entire animal had to die so I could have a, lunch. And he said, well, it's good to be conflicted. It's good to be conflicted. Why don't you check out this book? And he gave me that book. And, I've read that book I read it in succession, like 10 times in a row over like a period of a month. And then, every so often after that. But that was really, it's not, I have problems with books that preach, because I'm a rebel to a certain extent, or at least I resist when someone's telling me what the way should be. I usually run very hard in the other direction. So he doesn't preach in this book. He's pretty much lays out, here's all the wild animals, and he talks about, the animals throughout the world who are in the wild, and how that's, if we wanted in any moment, we could extinguish any animal on the planet. We as humans have that ability. He talks about factory farming and the reality, of it, because we're not really, if we knew we were buying piglets when we buy a package that's sealed in cellophane, or baby sheep or things along those lines, we'd probably be a little more reflective on that moment. But this book, I think, as I mentioned when I said to you, this book really just made me more mindful that I have a choice. What do I want to eat in every moment? And do I want that to be, another sentient being? And there's even studies that say that cows are even smarter than dogs. And so we see all the different types of animals in their places throughout the world, and we should know always in every moment that we have dominion over them, that we can extinguish them if we choose to, and there's sort of like we're doing that fairly effectively. But a friend of mine just invested in a company that makes synthetic meat. So they take a cell from a living animal and then they cultivate synthetic meat from it. And I think that will be our future.
Yes,
That,
I agree.
if you need to eat the meat of a cow, then no cow died to create that experience. But I think, we just should, people just in general, I'm not going to tell anyone how they should eat or what they should eat. And even at the end, at the very end, I'm going to buzzkill this, but at the very end, Scully says, this hasn't made me. Writing this entire book and doing all my research hasn't made me, a vegan. But it's made me very, very aware of when I eat another animal and when I don't. So.
And the way we treat them too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Deserves its place on your list. So number 8, The 10 Commitments by your mentor, David Simon.
Yes. Well, David Simon's premise was 10 commandments are always thou shalt not. And people obviously over the years have defied that in a certain sense. We've all defied that. We've all, resisted it or not bought into it. And why would that be? These are suddenly commandments that God gave Moses, and when they're supposed to be the foundations of every single civilization, well, why do people break that rule? And I think that was an important thing. So David Simon began writing sort of like the flip side of that. He said, commandments are always someone wagging their finger at you, and it's something external coming at you. Whereas commitments are sacred contracts that we're making with our souls. And we're more likely to keep those. So I thought that was so beautiful. So the 10 Commitments is a great book. It's David Simon's written a lot of books. His other book, Free to Love, Free to Heal, that I really recommend to people. Very, very cathartic and healing, for heart healing. But this can get woven into every aspect of our lives as well. Again, I consider this another universal book on the list that can apply to anyone in any moment.
And you said that after reading it, you made a commitment to make daily commitments at the end of your meditation practice.
Absolutely. I wasn't doing that before, and now it's part of my morning jam. Do I always adhere to the commitment? No, but a higher likelihood that when I'm going against it, I'll be like, oh, or when I'm doing nothing, you're like, hey, didn't I say I was going to be more? And that sort of sparks me to be a better version of myself.
Yeah. Number 9 is a book that I was really pleased to see because, I love this work, Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life, Marshall B. Rosenberg.
Yes, well, that's so powerful. I've taught 4-day workshops just on that.
Yeah.
So this is something that and probably I could go to a workshop and experience it for a year. These are the same teachings that have been brought to bear, quite honestly, in we can take our pick of what that looks like, but have been brought to bear in Middle Eastern peace talks. These are conversations that Palestinians are having with Israelis right now. They're using these tools. We will, right now, our society is so bifurcated. If we think about that, the polarization of everything that goes on, and really what this brings into the conversation, the teachings of Dr. Rosenberg, are that if we can show up with a certain amount of dignity, there's a higher likelihood, respect and dignity from both sides of the equation, there's a higher likelihood we're going to get our needs met. And we're not great communicators to begin with, and we don't usually, we think people are going to read our minds. David Simon used to call that you're ESPing all over yourself. When you're like, well, if you loved me, you'd know what I need. We all feel that in a certain way. But the reality is, no, we have to sort of articulate our needs. And if we are able to articulate them and express them in a way that does not carry past-laden emotional charge, then there's a higher likelihood that our needs will actually be met.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I've always said, the bottom of every argument is a misunderstanding. We just don't articulate clearly what it is we want and we need and wish to happen. And we're all doing it to each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Fabulous, fabulous work. Really, really do have a lot of admiration and respect for that. There was a lot more we could have said about that one, but we won't. We'll move on to number 10, which is Osho. And Osho comes up a lot as well. Absolute. Do you pronounce it Tao or Tao?
I pronounce it Tao.
Tao. Absolute Tao. Talks on fragments from Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. And this is Osho's version.
Yeah. Well, an interesting thing about Osho is that Osho really wasn't a book writer, although he's got 50 books to his credit. But he spoke every single day. He held satsangs every single day throughout his entire life, except for periods where he was in full-on silence. And fascinatingly enough, they were all transcribed. People took notes or recorded them. And Absolute Tao is a series of his lectures, beautifully edited. And Osho, I saved Osho for I hadn't remembered Absolute Tao was number 10. I saved Osho for number 10 because he is so controversial. There's even a Netflix documentary, I'll call it, called Wild Wild Country, and it pretty much bashes him. And Osho was distinctly imperfect, but I believe in his heart he was a rascal. And his mission was to always poke everyone out of their comfort zone. So when I'll talk about Osho and someone will send me an email, how dare you talk about Osho? I'm like, well, he's accomplished his mission. He clearly pushed you out of his comfort zone. And, there's a lot that we could, they once said to Osho, what's the deal? You tell everyone that they shouldn't care about their money. And meanwhile, you have 100 Rolls Royces that you're driving around on your ashram. And he would say, that is not true. I do not have 100. I have 87. I hope to have 100. He was so totally, at times, innocent and childlike and authentic. He slept with, hundreds of his, he is said to have slept with hundreds of his followers. And he never denied it. He was open. Now, of course, he was using his power to assert it over his followers. So we could say clear case of, sexual abuse on some way. But he never hid that. And so that, which is distinctly different from what's going on in our current environment. But those things take away from some of the brilliance that he provided. And so I'm always torn. Again, message or messenger, it's how do we, and I put this book on the list because I wanted people to, in Osho style, to be a little conflicted. What do we do with stuff that's brilliant, but it was written by someone that we have an issue with? You know, I'm conflicted with certain works or certain music of people that I used to respect, heroes who we've knocked off pedestals. So Osho never said, follow me. He never said I'm God. He was rascally, like I said. If his commentary, like if he wrote a review of his book, he would say, "You fool, you're reading that book, you should throw it into the fire right away and never think about it ever again." That's him. But Osho's viewpoint and his philosophy and the teachings that he shared with so many people in his world, I think are valuable, and I think they have stood the test of time. He died in the 90s, and I think I don't know. I think Absolute Tao is one of those books where you read it, you get touched by it. It sparks, he speaks about loneliness versus aloneness. He speaks about trying to be something that you're not. He speaks about meditation in all its various permutations and all the real world struggles that we have. So Osho, controversial, he'll always be controversial, but he really spoke so much about the power of that the answers to everything are resting inside of you, and you don't have to go someplace for them. You don't have to seek them someplace else. You just have to allow yourself to connect to that truth that rests within. And so I would recommend, his book, Book of Secrets. I think it's 1,100 pages. I would say don't start with that one. But if you're interested in Osho, Absolute Tao is a powerful, amazing, and very, very special book that will really awaken you. And it's a snapshot of time because it's a series of his satsangs just over a certain period of time where I think he was probably at his peak.
Well, and you said he was you do consider him a great teacher, even if you don't agree with everything he said, but he always forced you to pay attention to what matters in life. And what's interesting, given what we've been discussing about some of the books that have gone before, is that he did create his own 10 commandments, and you list the 10th one in your list. Do you want to share that with us?
Sure. His 10 commandments are all about, if someone's telling you they have the answer, run away from it. There is no real truth, other than God. He was also anti-religion, which of course tweaks people on a whole nother level.
Yeah.
But he was pro having a connection to the divine, but he felt that structured religion was really just another shackle. But his 10th commandment is, do not search. That which is. Stop and see.
That's a great one to end that list on. And what I notice about your list, this is the first time I've noticed it, is that it's almost as if there's a piece of every single book that you've listed in every single other book that you've listed. You can join the dots all the way through.
Familiar threads.
Yeah. Lovely. Okay, so if you had a young student just starting out, wanting you to be their mentor, which of these 10 books would you give them to begin with?
Well, young is relative, so I'm not sure, but I would
say beginner.
For the beginner, I would say a real loving and easy pathway is the 4 agreements, because it's not even 7, it's 4, and they're pretty basic, and they can be applied in any moment, and probably, and what Don Miguel talks about in the beginning of that, before we even get to the 4 agreements, he talks about the concept of domestication. And so if someone's really young, they're probably in that process of domesticating themselves in that moment. So that might be a great opportunity for them to go like, oh, I'm doing that right now. I'm 17 years old and I'm acting a certain way to please other people. And I'm sort of, dimming my light over here because other people aren't fans of it, or things along those lines. So I would say starting on some type of journey, the 4 agreements can sort of give you a beautiful framework, some really deep insights. And I would think that when you finish it, you would launch out into another one of these books as well.
Yeah, for sure. I do love the work of Don Miguel and his sons. In fact, we've got Don Miguel Jr. joining us in 2 weeks' time.
Oh my God.
So that, and I love his books too. Now, the keywords, I asked you to give me some keywords and phrases that you would use to describe yourself. And you came up, and these are meant to be sort of fun, not just the official bio stuff. And you said the owl, dark chocolate connoisseur, TV binge watcher, and Peaches Teaches. What is Peaches Teaches?
12 years ago, I adopted a mix between a Maltese and a Yorkshire Terrier. They call those Morkies, but I adopted a dog from an LA shelter, and I named her Peaches the Buddha Princess. And so people have asked me, who's the greatest spiritual teacher? You've met His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and you worked with Deepak, and you met Eckhart Tolle, and like all these other great sages, and you're friends with Wayne Dyer. Like, who's the one? And I always say, Peaches the Buddha Princess. In our 12 years together, she has taught me more than the wisest sage out there. Our first year together, we didn't even speak. Everything was like a silent thing. I didn't speak, she didn't speak. We meditated together. We still meditate together every single morning. And she teaches me consistently, her biggest lesson for me is resist nothing and you will receive unconditional love. Like, what's the reason that we're not just feeling the love in every moment? Because we're resisting so much stuff. We're resisting the moment. We're resisting what is. We're resisting COVID. We're resisting like everything that's happening. If we resisted just a little bit less, the walls would come down and we'd receive more unconditional love. So that's my Peaches Teaches.
Good. Okay, that explains it. Normally I ask someone to give me one more, something that only, their closest friend would know about them. But I think this serves the purpose for that. So Peaches Teaches it is. We are almost out of time. We've gone over the time that we said, an hour and 15, but there is a question. And I wonder whether you could just give us a couple of extra minutes to answer. Sure. There's been lots and lots of comments, and there probably are several more questions, but I'm just going to choose the one. And that is from Francis, who says, I love the common sense and approach you're sharing, especially when it comes to our day-to-day realities. Some respected teachers teach that we need to release our ego, and other respected teachers teach it's a vital part of us. Would you please share your belief about the ego?
Yeah, sure. Not to knock, probably Eckhart Tolle is one of the most popular teachers about ego and how we can dissolve it and transcend it. My definition of ego is it's your sense of self. Now, I could get into Adi Shankara's 7th century description of the layers of life and his definition of ego. But ego, his definition of ego is it's stuff we think we own. It's all the stuff in our life that we think we own. So our belief systems, our hairstyle, our religion, our food choices, or all those things. My definition is it's just your sense of self. Like when you look in the mirror, whatever you see, all the stuff that you're not revealing to the world. All the stuff that you're boldly announcing to the world. The stuff that we are, but we hide, is called our shadow self. It's important that we own that. And we could say, oh, it's nobody else's business. Oh, okay, you could do that as well. But I believe that the ego is, it's all the labels and all the identity that we have claimed for ourselves. I'm I vote this way. I eat this kind of food. I listen to this kind of music. I believe in this. This is important. That's not important. It's sort of like if you put a bumper sticker on the back of your car, it's the stuff that you'd be willing to, that you claim, that you own, that you think you own. In reality, we own nothing. We don't own our house. Probably the bank owns it. We don't own our car. Probably the bank owns it. We don't own our kids. Never did, never will. We don't, there's a whole list of stuff that we think we own. We even think we own the lane that we're driving in, right? Someone crosses into my lane and we get like really defensive or angry, or someone gets too close or too far. So there's a lot of ownership that we put out there. The I, me, mine of life. That's the ego. I don't think it's possible for us. Is it constricting? Absolutely. I don't think it's possible for us to have no ego. Even if I had the ego, I've let go of my ego. That would be like another statement of my ego, saying that I've let go of that. So I believe that we can't actually. I think we should pay attention to the labels and the identification that we do. Are we doing it, again, for someone else's benefit, or do we really feel that way? Ultimately, if we go back to the most ancient teachings, the most ancient teachings are, aham brahmasmi, I am the universe. And that every other thing in our ego is actually an illusion. It's something it's a construct that we've made, so that we look smarter or more attractive or more friendly, or, like these are all interactions. But the reality is, as long as we're sealed in this flesh casing for the span of a lifetime, we're going to need to figure out some way. What's our persona? How are we going to flow what's inside of us into the outside world? So my personal feeling on the ego is, I'll give the perfect example. Wayne Dyer defined ego as EGO, edging God out. And so it's in that moment where you see yourself as so distinctly separate, that's probably not the best expression of your ego. When you see yourself as one with everything and unseparated from everything, still self-definition, it's still your ego, but I think it's a more expanded understanding of who you are in that moment. Hopefully that answers that question.
I think that's a great answer. Thank you so much. Davidji, there's lots and lots of messages in the chat room of people who have really enjoyed listening to you today, talking about your books. They're going to add these books to their lists as well, which is great. Let's get everybody reading. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your current 10 best spiritual books. And what can I say? It's been a pleasure.
Hey, thank you so much for inviting me. It was challenging when I first started writing it. I was like, oh my God, this is a really big assignment. I haven't been given an assignment like this in a long time, but it was such a joyous assignment, and it really forced me to answer that question. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thank you for raising the vibration of books. Where would we be without books? Exactly. And thanks to everyone who showed up for this. I didn't know if it was just going to be you and me, Sandie, chatting about my book list. But thank you, everyone who's taken the time out of your day and night to hang out with us.
Thank you. And we will be sharing this everywhere. Within the week, we just tidy up a few things, put some bumpers on it, and share it all over the place. So it will get seen. Great. And if this inspires people to read these books, then it's done its job.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's it. If you want to know more, if you want to get heavily meditated with David G, check out his website, davidji.com. You can learn so much there, and you can also download all kinds of things, including the first chapter of his latest book, Sacred Powers. And thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have your company tonight. We're here every Wednesday at the same time doing another one of these interviews. So feel free to join us anytime you want. And we'll be back again next week. I'll see you then. Thank you.